In 2002, if you wanted CRM, you wrote a $2 million check to Siebel Systems. The implementation took 18 months, and you needed a 5-person IT team to keep it running. Siebel had 45% of the CRM market. Fortune named them the fastest growing company in America. 3 years later, Oracle bought them in a salvage deal for $5.8 billion. Their customers had quietly left for a startup that charged $65 a month and ran in a browser window. That startup was Salesforce. In February of this year, Salesforce stock dropped 28% in 48 hours. $2 trillion in software market cap, gone over 30 days. Every analyst called it the SaaS apocalypse. The reason? AI agents that automate the exact workflows that justified those per-seat subscriptions. The disruptor got disrupted. 6 weeks later, the rebound began. Oracle and ServiceNow led it. ServiceNow shipped agentic ACV, customers paying for AI-completed tasks instead of human logins. Half their contract value, their new contract value, is now non-seat based. Their 2026 AI target jumped from $1 billion to $1.5 billion. The vendors who pivoted led the recovery, and the vendors who bolted AI onto seat licenses did not. So that's the movie. It's not the crash, it's the pivot. And whether you're in the channel, in manufacturing, in finance, or running a portfolio company, you're in it right now. We all are. The structural forces are the same ones that drove SaaS 20 years ago. Today, I have 3 people who have also seen this movie. They're going to help me show you the script. Welcome to No AI Theater. I'm Cosmo Mariano. Before I bring in my guests, I want to take a moment to tell you about the company behind this show. This episode is brought to you by XSparks, a global AI transformation company. Our AI operating model helps mid-market leaders stop running AI pilots and start running their business, their companies on AI. And we're accountable from idea to outcome. Now, let me introduce my guests. First, Rod Bapty, 30 years organizing the rooms where every major channel transition gets argued. Rob founded Bapty & Company in 1993, built Channel Focus into the world's largest channel community, 7,000 members, and runs Partner TechX, where executives from Google, Microsoft, Zoom, and ServiceNow show up. If a platform shift happened in the last 3 decades, Rod was in the room when it got debated. Welcome, Rod.
Cosmo, thank you very much for inviting me.
Next up is Nick Tidd. Nick runs Global Channel for Zoom, a company that just pivoted from video platform to AI-first workplace and is actually publishing the receipts. Their AI companion launched as agentic. Monthly active users tripled year over year, and every one of their 10 largest customer experience deals last quarter included paid AI. 16 years in channel, at Poly, at HP, and now Zoom. Nick is living the transition the rest of us are about to talk about. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Cosmo. My gosh, 16 years. You're giving me the benefit of youth. I've been doing this as long as Rod. Just one other quick observation. This is a unique panel, man. You got 3 Canadians and a Scotsman. We can take this on the road.
It's a good point. Last but not least, Jason Dia. Jason has built and sold SaaS products across multiple cycles, Honeybee to Green Shield Canada and Uberflip through the Path Factory acquisition. Now he's at Koru, the venture studio backed by the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, where he evaluates AI readiness across the portfolio. Founder, operator, and now investor. Jason has seen this from every chair. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Cosmo.
All right. And you're right. Great to have you guys here. I didn't realize, of course, I forgot, Nick, you were Canadian. And of course, we got the Scotsman, who is always an honorary Canadian as far as I'm concerned. So, okay. before I open the floor to the conversation, I want to plant three flags. There are three parallels I see between SaaS in 2001 and AI in 2026 that explain what we should already know about how this movie's going to go. Okay, let me start with the first one, the objections. Here's what we heard in SaaS about SaaS in 2001. Our data can't live on someone else's servers. The internet isn't reliable. We need customization. Banking said regulatory compliance made it impossible. Manufacturing said the production floor was too specialized. Rod, you were in those rooms when those objections were getting argued out. What was the dominant objection at the time in the channel, and how did the people raising it eventually change their minds?
Let me step back to that time and talk about two meetings I had very early in the piece. And they were about 2 days apart. So the first was with a group of channel partners. It was in London, but the channel partners were from across Europe. And the whole discussion was about how difficult it was to move the customers to the cloud. Was it going to happen? Wasn't it going to happen? How was it going to happen? And of all the groups in Europe, the ones that were going to be the most difficult were the French. 2 days later, I'm sitting in Paris with about 30 CISOs from the biggest companies in France. The conversation wasn't about, we've got to stop the cloud. The conversation wasn't about, the cloud is never going to happen. The conversation was about, it's happening. What do we have to do to protect our companies as we make the shift? I think the thing we need to be very careful of is, who are we talking to? AI is happening. Pilots are going on. Implementations are happening. Implementations are going on. And it's happening all the time. Who are we talking to? Are we talking, for example, when we're talking to our partners, to all of our partners, many of whom are not making the transition to the cloud themselves, or to the partners that are, and the new partners, the born in AI partners, who are helping that transition? It's not will it happen, it's not may it happen, it's actually happening now, and it's happening right across the board.
Yeah, I hear you. I think, that's really it. The objections, any objections that we hear are kind of defining the timeline, but they're not defining the direction, right? People know they got to get there. It's more about, how quickly can we do it, right? Okay, so that's the first parallel. The second one is about the economics. Look at what SaaS did. Siebel CRM cost $2 million and took 18 months to implement. Salesforce came in at $65 per user per month, live in weeks by comparison. SaaS moved software from CapEx to OpEx. Nick, Zoom has lived the economic compression on the SaaS side. Now you're living the agentic shift on the AI side. From inside a company that's done both, when does a customer cross the line from this is interesting to this is the only way we can run?
Well, I think what's very exciting about this opportunity, and many of us who've been doing this for a while kind of refer to these as the technology windows. And you can look back, you referenced Siebel to Salesforce, we have on-prem PBX to cloud. Those technology windows, they're paramount to embrace. And if you don't embrace them, you're going to get left behind. And we all could write books about all of it. But what's really interesting is you can feel that moment when it happens. At first, customers treat, and many have treated AI like a pilot. They test it in one workflow, maybe summaries or ticket routing. It's interesting, but it's kind of still optional. And then the shift happens. Yeah. They start connecting the moments. And this is why at Zoom, we're very excited about this moment in time, because the prep before a meeting, the conversation itself, the follow-up actions, the customer engagement that comes after, it realizes it's one continuous flow. And that's when they cross the line. I look at me personally. I don't take notes in meetings anymore. My note taker takes it. You've got my complete attention in a meeting. And if I'm double booked, it's a team. Don't move everybody around. I'll listen to the recording. I'll get the AI summary. I'll make sure that, and we call that systems of action. When that moves from conversation to completion without losing the context is when a customer sees that orchestration from end to end, when their teams stop re-entering data and chasing updates and seeing outcomes appear automatically. That's kind of like the aha moment. The friction disappears. It's at that point where AI stops being a tool and becomes infrastructure. And ladies and gentlemen, the economics around that model is a moment in time that we're all going to have to embrace. And I know we're going to come back and talk about this later on, but this is going to be very disruptive and a tremendous opportunity for all of our channel ecosystems.
Yeah. All right. I can't wait to dig into that. All right. So that brings us to the third and final parallel, the window, right? And, early SaaS adopters between 2002 and 2006, they didn't just buy cheaper software. They restructured their operating models. We're doing a lot of this. Concur pivoted. They hit 72% margins. SaaS eventually paid $8.3 billion. By the time AWS launched in 2006, the game was over. Jason, from the investor seat at Koru, when you look at portfolio companies right now, what does the AI window look like to you? What separates the operators using it from the one hoping, the window still stays open?
So when I look at the landscape of AI and opportunities for AI and kind of maybe my guess at the winners and losers of AI is a little bit different than some of these other movies that I've seen before. Fundamentally, if I look at kind of the SaaS transition that you described of Siebel to Salesforce, the key sort of foundational insight was, I can solve this problem better, faster, stronger. In the case of SaaS, a lot of that leaned on cheaper. I think one of the challenges for vendors, especially in the age of AI, is to have a real authenticity in your position when it comes to the value of AI. There's actually two sides or two dimensions to that opportunity coin. The first is kind of historically, what's your point of view? What's your perspective on solving your customer problem a little bit better? The other more interesting one is something that both Nick and Rod touched on, which is fundamentally AI is a transformational opportunity for your workflows, specifically for your workflows. So as a vendor, if you haven't changed how you do business and you haven't changed how you deliver value to your customers, not just the value that you deliver to your customers, then it's hard for you to internalize how to champion that change management and that workflow transformation to your customers. Likewise, it's really hard for you to visualize and internalize, the transformational opportunity for AI. So it's really interesting. It's almost like an internal race that I see portfolio companies that I work with having. Step one in the race, or the first half of the race, is adopting AI natively. What does that mean to your business from an efficiency standpoint, from a workflow standpoint, from a resourcing standpoint, from a functional standpoint? And then step two is how can you actually directly apply that to the value that you're actually delivering to your customers?
Yeah, we are seeing that every day at XSpark. So we actually, we see it, we deliver it in two ways. Sometimes it'll often start with a pilot on an intern, just an idea that it can come from any department, marketing, even product, but product, we don't, get that first pilot, see that first pilot. We see it, customer in services or customer support. But then after that pilot, they realize they can do it across all their internal operations and then their product as well. So we find ourselves creating a center of excellence to transform all the internal workflows, and then an accelerator that usually works with customers and their products to pilot either agentic features or new agentic products with a flagship customer, and then go to a beta cohort, and then go GA, and then launch it with a wider release. So we're seeing the exact same thing. Start off internally, use those workflows, then the light bulb goes off, and then we see it in the product happen in accelerators in the product as well. Yeah, makes perfect sense. All right. So those are the three parallels that I see, and each of you help me bring them to life. But between the three of you, and we already covered the numbers on this, there's probably 70 years of experience watching technology transition, reshape entire industries. So I just want to ask you, what are we missing? What am I missing? What parallels do you see that I haven't named yet? Who wants to go?
I think I'd come back to the economics. right? The entire SaaS business model was built on a seat subscription, which maximized revenue by measuring human input. AI agents are forcing vendors to monetize output instead of input, resulting in a fundamental mutation of value creation. And all of the channel partner ecosystems, you think about the way this industry's been built, it's gonna put itself on its head. It's gonna force distribution to rethink their models. Marketplaces are gonna become more accretive. The traditional reseller, SI, advisor, agent, it's just a complete change. And I'll reference the 7 years. I'm glad I'm on the other side of it, because I don't know. I don't know what I can't predict at the moment, and that's the really cool part.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to that?
I think we're seeing. Sorry, after you, Jason. Go for it.
Oh, thanks, Rob. I'll just make a comment on sort of what Nick mentioned. It's kind of the transformational opportunity or challenge when it comes to monetization of these products. I think one of the inherent sort of opportunities or problems, depending on how you want to approach it, out in the market is retraining customers. So, historically, touching on a movie that I've seen before, outcome-based pricing on paper always sounds really great. But the challenge that I've seen a multitude of vendors come across is kind of alignment on the definition of what that outcome is. So, a great example that I'll use is in the marketing context. Many marketing vendors, SaaS vendors, have explored the idea of let's charge per outcome, let's charge per lead. And inevitably, what happens is there becomes an attribution problem. A, how do you define the lead? B, how can you prove that the lead came from you? And what I expect is, sort of a similar circumstance will come out of AI, sort of outcome-based pricing, because outcome-based pricing is also very different than usage-based pricing in the context of AI, token usage, etc. So how do you kind of reconcile and rationalize that conversation? And ultimately, because of the macro impact of AI, almost train an entire market to think a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I think if I can come into that from a partner perspective, if we look back, 40% of partners went bust during the cloud era, and a whole bunch of new partners emerged. They didn't just emerge, they had new business models. They had a new way of doing business. They had a new way of engaging with their customers. The same thing is going to happen with AI. And I think that's going to pose problems throughout the partner ecosystem. I think you're going to see more and more partners emerging who aren't interested in some kind of credit, money or otherwise, from the vendors. They're going to be making their money out of providing services, support, etc. And so I think there's going to be a big challenge in terms of the partners' business model as we move forward. And I think a lot of the vendors are going to have real problems trying to understand what their partner business model is. And I don't want to be in Nick's shoes when suddenly there are a whole raft of Zoom partners who aren't actually part of the transaction, but are fundamental to Zoom. And poor old Nick is trying to convince the CFO that we need to support these guys because they're absolutely fundamental to Zoom's success moving forward.
Yeah. Everyone's in the AI business from now forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, that's the intellectual case. But, every one of us has had a moment where this stopped being kind of an intellectual argument where we were seeing facts emerging, and it became something that we felt, right? That little spidey sense in the back. I'll tell you that movie that we've been talking about. So I'll tell you when I saw the movie, and, I'll tell you, what movie I saw first and how I recognized it. So in the first decade of the 2000s, I was running a digital marketing agency. We did strategy, creative services, campaign execution, program management for consumer and B2B go-to-market plans. It was standard agency work, and we'd been doing it for years. But then the SaaS wave hit. Our clients wanted in. They saw what Salesforce and HubSpot were doing. And, they wanted what their competitors were getting: pipeline transparency, marketing automation, sales velocity. But they had a problem. They were sitting on, 20 years of legacy systems, custom databases, on-prem CRM, marketing teams who couldn't send an email without getting IT involved. So we, as you just mentioned, Rob, like, the partners, we adapted, right? We started offering SaaS setup, integration, operations management. We ran their Salesforce, their HubSpot, even their Microsoft 365. We became the augmented infrastructure their marketing and sales teams used to break free of IT and pivot to a new way of working, right? So over time, those teams, those companies, they caught up, they hired in, they built the muscle, and they brought it back in-house. And in fact, for full transparency, that's really the same business model we're running at XSparks now with AI, right? Where it's a different technology, but it's the same pattern. We provide the augmented, outsourced AI infrastructure and services so companies can pivot. So when someone tells me, it's the same playbook, it's just a different decade. So when someone tells me AI is going to be, too risky to deploy or their team isn't ready, I've heard that before. I heard it, 10 to 20 years ago from CMOs at Fortune 500 companies. And I heard, about Salesforce when Salesforce was really driving. So I kind of know how this goes. Rod, you've watched channel leaders, you've watched the shift. Tell me about the specific moment when the AI conversation started rhyming with the SaaS conversation. I think I even saw you on stage mention it once.
I think in most of the major companies, the channel leadership understands the AI shift is happening. When did they start to understand that? Well, one of the fundamental changes was when we were approached just over 2 years ago about the technology that was being used to run the channel ecosystem. And it was after a channel executive council meeting, and I was sitting with a group of folks, and they said, we know the technology is changing. We know what we've got isn't going to cut it moving forward. Problem is, we don't know who's out there and what they've got. And that led to the development of PartnerTech X and everything that happened there. I think the big challenge is going to be how do you move the business model? How do you deal with the factors around that? If you move to a consumption model or an outcome-based model, one of the key people that you're going to have to bring to the table is the CFO, because suddenly they're going to have a bill that is not predetermined, that is not, this is what it's going to be this month. It's based on consumption or it's based on outcomes. And so it's going to be variable. That's going to be a huge challenge. It's going to pose a huge challenge for the partner community in terms of how that works. And so I think there are other issues. Everyone, I think now, most of the major companies know this is happening. They understand they have to be part of it. Some are doing it very well. Some are doing it not so well. Some are really struggling. Some, like Zoom, have done an amazing job of leveraging the AI revolution. What you've also got to look at is the back end. And within all of this, I think one of the things we've got to look at is how do we bring the CFO on board inside our customers, inside our own companies? Because at the moment, with the way the market is, they have enormous power. And they understand they have a goal to drive their companies forward. And so there needs to be that. I think AI is going to make it a much deeper conversation between the ecosystem and finance in terms of where we're headed and how we bring those things together.
Yeah. By the way, and just to add on to your story, I mean, I think I saw you get really excited when NVIDIA demoed their General Motors avatar that they brought, right? And you brought that excitement to the conference, and you shared that with the conference. And I remember that being kind of a light bulb moment for a lot of people in the room, right? Nick, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No.
Yeah. Nick, what about you?
I think what I would encourage, Rod talked about the internal constituents you need to work with. Don't underestimate your partner community and the power of partner advisory councils and getting out to events I'll share an observation I had at my partner advisory council last year when we launched AI Companion. And one of our largest partners, someone who's been with us since the early UCAS days, said to me, this feels like when we moved from PBXs to the cloud.
Yeah.
Everybody's curious.
Yeah.
Nobody's ready. And 6 months from now, everybody will pretend they saw it coming, right? So it's like, how do you bring these people along? And, that stuck with me because I can go back in my career, and I know many of the participants can. I go back to my Polycom days. I'll take you back to 2017 when we were on-prem, building big immersive studios, and I could charge outrageous PS revenue to mediate rooms for earthquakes, and we pivoted from on-prem to cloud and became that endpoint, and it was no longer a luxury add-on, but a necessity. So same movie, different cast. The pattern never changes.
Yeah.
The acceleration changes and the technology shifts, but the objections sound familiar. Partners who lean in early rewrite the playbooks for everybody else, as Rod alluded to. And I'll share with you in early, it was late March, we did our analyst conference. And we were doing a panel, which Rod knows I love doing panels, and those of you who see me on panels. And one of the analysts said, Nick, which competitor do you fear the most? And I said, honestly, I don't fear any competitor. What I fear is the ability for the community to embrace the change at the acceleration that we need to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And that to me is and we'll come back and talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But at Zoom, when we stopped talking about AI as a feature and started showing it as a workflow, that's when partners saw meetings, messages, and customer interactions all feeding one intelligent system of action. And that's when it clicked. The conversation moved from what is this to how fast can I build it? And this is where we're going to see this emergence. And Rod talked about a little bit, the delivery of AI services. It's going to fundamentally change the delivery model. You're going to have more influencers. You're going to have more partners engaged in action, and it's going to change that economic value proposition. But just a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. 100%. Okay. Let's go on to the next segment. So those are the stories. We just covered the stories that made that pattern real for each of us, but I want to get into the evidence. So let me walk you through some of the data, and then, I'll give each one of you a piece, and, maybe you could put it in context for us. So the first piece of evidence is what I call the incumbent comfort trap, and then the pivot test that comes after it. So the comfort trap, right? Siebel had 45% market share in 2002, Fortune's fastest growing company in 1999. But by January 2005, the IDC was calling them a sitting duck, right? Oracle acquired them for $5.8 billion that September. It was totally a salvage deal, certainly not a triumph. 3 years from, sitting pretty to, close out. Now, the SaaS apocalypse hit between January and February, roughly $2 trillion in software market cap erased. Salesforce down 28% in 48 hours. Atlassian down 35%. By March, the SaaS sector was trading below the S&P 500 for the first time in the cloud era. But then around April 13th, we see that V-shaped rebound. ServiceNow and Oracle led it by introducing agentic ACV, outcome-based pricing, which Jason you spoke about, for this AI completed work. So Nick, you're inside one of the vendors that pivoted. You just mentioned it. Walk us through that, what that decision looked like at Zoom. How did you decide between bolting AI on and rethinking the platform? And what are you watching, from vendors who took the bolt-on route? What are you seeing from them?
I think the easy path would have been to bolt AI onto existing products and treat it like another feature, release it and call it innovation, right? But the platform, it's changing the workflow. And that's what our teams did with AI Companion. And more importantly, a federated AI architecture, where we built kind of this semantic layer that understands the context across meetings, chat, phone, docs, customer interaction. So it meant rewriting how data moves through the system. So AI can turn conversations into completed work and not just summaries. And that's where it gets really interesting, because from a product portfolio, this is why we separated product like our virtual agent from our contact center, in that the concept is not to replace the human. The concept is to augment the human's productivity, to make AI a first-class citizen, not a widget.
Yeah.
It was a structural decision and not a marketing one. So, be careful of those bolt-ons. So what I'm watching now from vendors who took the bolt-on route is the same thing we saw in the early SaaS era. Fragmentation, the ability to charge more. You can feel it in the customer experience. And that's where AI lives in a sidebar, not in a workflow. It's clever, but it's not transformative. And so when you look at those adoption rates of AI and our approach of bundling it with full license and making it part of the workflow, where others have chosen to charge for it. So the real pivot happens when AI stops being a feature and starts being the operating system of how things get done. And that's the difference, really, Cosmo, between adding intelligence and becoming intelligent. And that's the really cool piece at Zoom that I love. It drives my partner community crazy. Like, I can't keep up with you. You're announcing so many features so fast. But that, fundamentally starts with Eric on down, is that paranoia of missing the window.
Yeah.
And we often joke internally, there's regular time and there's Zoom time. And Zoom time goes at a quantum to regular time. And that's the really cool thing that I love about what I get an opportunity to do. And I get many of our partners like, hey, can I have a roadmap? I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen, because at the rate of innovation, we're just going to try to keep you informed of what we're doing.
Yeah, I got to say, I was shocked at how quickly Zoom made that massive transformation, that massive change, because I was watching other, vendors bolt on. We're seeing it every day. We're still seeing the bolt-ons every day. And when, we talked last year, I think it was like almost a year ago when you were already, sharing some of these changes, and I couldn't believe how quickly Zoom had pivoted. So, kudos to you guys, but are there what structurally, if you're allowed to tell us, is, what did Zoom do to accelerate the way they did?
I think it's understanding how to take that conversation to completion and the analytics that come with the conversation, and this emerging economy of what I call AI services, right? If you think about that agentic model and taking to completion, that's where the community has to build the agents. The community has to, and that's that whole new economic value proposition. So it's creating a federated approach of having a single platform that understands that productivity suite. That was kind of the turning point for us, and where obviously meetings, we understand that flow. It's the heart of the meetings platform. 3 years now into CX and on the Gartner Magic Quadrant, with over 2,500 customers now on the platform in 3 years. It's Zoom Phone now over 10 million users. It's how do you connect the pieces, which is an example of, we could have done bolt-ons with all three.
Yeah.
But we did it cross-platform. So that conversation and the analytics and being able to create that completion.
Yeah.
And it's not resting. It's not, I don't want to be a Siebel. I don't want to be a 3Com. I don't want to be a Palm. I don't want to be a US Robotics. All in my DNA. It's like learning from your experience and accelerating that change.
Yeah, and I don't want to pull the headline too quickly, but this keeps emerging, right? This is an operating model shift, a product, rethinking your product fundamentally, right? And then an economic model shift as well, right? So it really is completely transforming your business. It's not about adding this AI as tools, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done. Okay. So then let me move to the second piece of evidence. This one is really about the objections themselves that I already mentioned. So whether they're real and how long they're going to last. And, you guys have already mentioned that maybe we're not seeing that many objections anymore, but I will, there are still some that I know are hanging around. So the SaaS objections were legitimate in 2002. The three things converged, right? Broadband, virtualization, and browser maturity. And so by 2009, Salesforce crossed $1 billion in revenue. Now, AI objections are also legitimate, hallucinations, privacy, and auditability, really specifically. And, Klarna got that wrong on their first try. They had 2.3 million AI conversations, and they replaced 700 agents and reported $40 million in impact. Then satisfaction dropped, and the CEO, had to publicly course correct. The interesting part isn't that humans came back. To me, it's how they came back. Klarna runs a hybrid model now. AI handles the routine inquiries while humans handle the escalation, and the humans are flexible contract. They're not full-time anymore. So Gartner's predicting that half the organizations that planned big customer service workforce cuts will abandon those plans by 2007, and most will end up where Klarna did. So, Jason, when you're talking to portfolio companies, what are there still AI objections that you're hearing? What are the ones that you hear the most? And how do you answer it now versus how you maybe answered it, 18 months ago?
So I think the macro change in how people are starting to approach AI, and I think it should continue to accelerate, is if we rewound the clock a year ago, if I pull in an old school analogy, if you have a big enough hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that was the approach. Largely, you can make an argument driven by marketing hype that people were taking with AI. The Klarna example is a great one. AI gave them this big hammer that they could do fairly drastic cuts across the board. The reality is, like any other tool, there's a time and a place. And I think we are starting to get to a place where the fidelity of the conversations we're having about AI is much greater, and the applicability of AI as a, granted, very powerful tool for specific tasks is changing. So if you look at AI and sort of where the market, the sort of overall market has come to, we are realizing that AI is very good at certain things by design. It's very good at manipulating text, as an example. So if you think about text manipulation and predictability around, vectorized text as a core competency of AI, guess what? The floor of certain vertical markets has started to raise. Legal tech, historically a very bad market, at least from an investor perspective for SaaS, has become arguably the best market for AI, because that now much more specific hammer of AI as a tool is such an empowering tool in that world where, fundamentally lawyers are all about not ripping you off 15 minutes at a time, but manipulating text and understanding sort of patterns associated with written word, right? So I think where the market has evolved is getting to that place where the specificity of the value of AI is starting to be applied in an equally specific and high fidelity manner to specific problems. The pattern that I see is actually not SaaS per se, but mobile. I think the last big technological shift that I saw in my career was the emergence of mobile.
Yeah.
And generation one, big hammer, everything is a nail, was just taking all these SaaS applications and squishing down the user experience into a tiny screen. What it manifested there was minimal value to customers. But the second generation of mobile applications actually took a step back and said, mobile is an empowering tool and an empowering technology platform. There are specific use cases, contexts that couldn't be done before, couldn't be reached for customers, on the go or on the toilet, you can make an argument. And those new generation of applications were the ones that manifested the most value. A consumer example would be GPS-enabled maps applications like a Waze or like a Google Maps. And I think we're on the cusp of getting to that sort of mass market understanding of the applicability and specificity of where AI can be the ideal tool to solve problems that weren't solved in the past.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's a huge, of course, it's so obvious, but you just kind of blew my mind. I totally see that movie too. And you're right, mobile AI for me hasn't really hit my mobile device as much. I'm crazy with it on the desktop, right? I use it every day, all day long, but on my mobile device, I'm still using it, discreetly, right? Excellent point. Okay, so third beat, Rod, I always come back to you for those financial, because I know those financial discussions, because I know you love talking about the CFO, how important it is. The dot, I just want to make sure we're still recording. All right. So in 2001, the dot-com bust killed the justification for on-prem CapEx, right? So every CFO suddenly had a board mandate to find cost. Concur completed its SaaS pivot by 2005 because of that pressure, not in spite of it. So, now we've got this post zero interest rate period, right? Margin pressure is doing the same thing right now. AI isn't being sold as innovation. It's being sold as cost structure. Same conversation that flipped buyers from Siebel to Salesforce. So, Rod, have you seen, a channel executive flip from exploring to AI to need AI now specifically because of margin pressure? Or, what do you think the CFOs are saying? What's your perspective on all this?
CFOs are under pressure. The CFOs in our industry are under pressure. They're under severe pressure. And they're under pressure from, if you take the tech industry, they're under pressure from a number of different directions. If you look at the amount of money that the major players are investing in AI, the Microsofts, the AWS, NVIDIA, etc. And a lot of that investment is circular. If you look, for example, at Azure, and you look at the commit, 40% of Azure's commit is actually OpenAI, which Microsoft have invested a vast amount of money in.
Right.
OpenAI are buying a gazillion, or responsible for the purchase of a gazillion chips. Lo and behold, NVIDIA is investing in OpenAI also. So I personally think we are in a dot-com bubble. That doesn't mean that AI is going to fail. You brought up basically the dot-com and what happened. The same will happen with AI. There are numerous companies, I'm sure Jason can talk about this more effectively than I can, where there have been huge investments. Companies like Zoom will thrive and do extraordinarily well. For every Zoom, there will be 10,000 AI companies that go bust. There will be, if you look at, for example, again, OpenAI, before the issue with Iran, Deutsche Bank did an analysis and they reckoned it would cost another $143 billion before OpenAI might break even in 2030. That is 7 times more than the next most expensive investment in a company before it broke even. Not 1.5 times, not double, but 7 times. The amount of money is just extraordinary. And so I think we're going to see a whole bunch of people saying, I told you so. Look at what happened. Look at the bubble. Look at it bursting. AI is not there. No, that's the wrong message. What the message is, it's happening. It's going to happen. The CFOs are under huge pressure to make it happen because they need to make it happen, because the first company that does it, everyone else has to follow. They have no option. And so you're going to see a very, very significant number of impacts on the financial markets and on what's happening as we move forward. What's going to result from that is the winners will emerge, and they will be even stronger than they were before.
Yeah. Jason, I saw you nodding. Is there anything you want to add to that? Because I have a little addition too, I think.
Well, I think Rod is, on the money with his commentary. I think it's important to decouple 2 separate conversations. Conversation number 1 is inevitable, which is AI is an enabling technology and capability that will bring immense value to companies, people, so on and so forth. Really, the question is, going back to the .com, movie that we've seen, is who's going to be the Amazon, and then who will be the rest. The second conversation, which Rod touched on, which maybe strikes a different kind of nerve is the financial markets conversation around AI. The fact that the valuation of the hyperscalers and the foundational model providers is contingent on the arithmetic that everybody in the world will use it at a certain rate. That's a different conversation altogether that I think obscures and clouds the value conversation, which at least knock on wood, for most people is the more valuable one versus sort of the financialization conversation.
Yeah, what I'm noticing, especially as I go in to talk to, we do a lot of business with mid-market, all the way from lower mid-market to upper mid-market. When I'm speaking to those CFOs and CEOs, they've tried this before. You guys have already mentioned it. There's a lot of failure rates happening in terms of pilots and this pivot. So they knew they had to do it. They started doing it, but we know the reasons. I could touch on bad data and infrastructure and change management, all the things. And these are all the services we provide, but the services that all these other providers are going to start bringing to the table around AI. But what I'm noticing is that you can't afford too many failures. Time is crushing people. You're losing a lot of ground. I think it was Harvey, the legal software, right, that raised $11 billion to pursue AI, built their entire AI solution, like say Zoom did, but they weren't successful like Zoom. They just pulled that back and I think dropped it 3 weeks ago. They pulled that product because the big models, I think it was OpenAI, was already doing a better job than their trained legal models on their platform. So $11 billion raised, huge product failure, no traction in the market, and how much ground have they lost? So now they're pivoting to services. So we're going to see a lot of that in those crashes. We're going to see a lot of messy scenarios, right, with companies as they're pivoting. Okay. So I want to talk through this last piece of evidence. I think it's the last one. Per seat economics. We're up here, and now let's maybe kind of zoom down. We know SaaS invented the per seat subscription, the entire ecosystem, right? Valuations, multiples, growth rates, comp plans. It was all built on that seat count. But now per seat is breaking, and I want to give you just a couple pieces of evidence, right? Clearly, that first one, ServiceNow shipping agentic ACV in April, half of their new contract value is now on non-seat based. We know that their targets jumped, and AI bundles are driving 20 to 30% of average price lifts. So Nick, Zoom has seat-based pricing, AI capabilities, AI companion at $10 to $20 per user. How are you thinking about the per seat economics inside Zoom, and what does the conversation sound like, internally when ServiceNow and other companies start shipping these agentic ACV?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, and Jason touched on this earlier. The economics of AI don't fit neatly into a per seat model. Historically, Zoom has priced on a per seat basis. You buy a license and you get access to AI companion. That worked when was tied to human usage, meetings, messages, but AI value scales with outcomes and not logins. So internally, we're asking, what's the right unit of value when the user may be an agent completing the work? That's why you're seeing us experiment AI companion at $10 to $20, as you mentioned, gives customers predictability and entry points, and you can get under the hood. And we're already modeling usage-based models and workflow-based pricing. But the goal is to make sure that the economics align with how customers actually consume intelligence and not just how they provision seats. You mentioned ServiceNow. When they shipped agentic ACV, it validated the next wave, and software revenue was measured by completed actions and not active users. And that just opens up a whole different can of worms. And you talk about, if you're in a two-tier model, how you do the pass-through. If you're in the traditional distribution, how are they going to bill for that?
Yeah, so Rod mentioned that.
The internal conversations sound a lot like the ones when we moved from hardware to UCaaS, and you got to keep it simple. Simplicity, customers love simplicity. But when you let the business model reflect the new physics of work, that's where it gets challenging. So, kind of that's where we're headed, towards a world where AI isn't just a line item on a license. It's an engine with measurable outcomes that allow us to scale. But as Rod put it earlier, this is what keeps me up at night, is how do I move this partner ecosystem and spot those that are going to rise to the top while maintaining that base. And that's why I didn't touch the valuation conversation before. That's out of my swim lane as a lot of people watching our stock. I'm not going down that path. But how do you maintain that top line revenue and continue to demonstrate growth and move this thing at the same time? And that's it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Jason, I'm going to ask you to kind of go in a little bit more on that outcome pricing. But before, I just want to bring something up because, it's a little bit down the rabbit hole, but you made me think of it, Nick. Jason, is a product leader, and I've worked in product too. And, we've talked a lot about jobs to be done theory, right? And this is very inside baseball around product where, Clayton Christensen invented jobs to be done, and, how creating value and innovating is around getting a specific, let's call it a workflow done that has very specific desired outcomes that it delivers on, though. And, every particular workflow or job has up to 150 outcomes that customers are looking for. And, those are those desired outcomes. And the more you can deliver, that's the value that your solution to that job to be done, is evaluated, that value. And so, when we talk about outcomes and we talk about outcome-based pricing, my brain keeps going back to jobs to be done and how many of those desired outcomes are we fulfilling for a client. So Nick, as you're saying, what are we getting done? And then how do we monetize it? My brain goes to product management. So, going to the product leader, enterprise definitely has a preference for outcome-based pricing. It hit 21.7% in this year, reaching parity with seat-based pricing for the first time in the cloud era. So now Gartner is expecting 40% of contracts to include outcome-based elements by the year end. Third, this isn't just SaaS. Intercom charges 99 cents per AI resolved ticket, and Zendesk is charging $1.50 to $2. So if AI agents handle quality control on the factory floor, the per head model for industrial services changes too. So, we mentioned some of how all these services and the pricing around them are going to change. So if Goldman Sachs drafts an IPO prospectus in minutes now, advisory billing changes, right? Because it used to take 6 bankers 2 weeks to do that. Customer service and data entry point headcount is already down 15 to 20% at AI leading companies. So, Jason, from the investor seat, what does this kind of pricing model breakdown mean for portfolio valuations when you're modeling a SaaS company today? And we're getting specific about SaaS. And how is per seat parity changing the multiples you're underwriting?
So I think it's in flux. I think it is changing. I think, rightly or wrongly, I think a lot of elements in life in a 2x2 matrix. So if you think about the fundamental value of SaaS pricing as it relates to valuation, the 2 axes of the 2x2 matrix for SaaS pricing was very clear. Axis number 1, Nick, you touched on, which is predictability. One of the benefits of per seat pricing is it's very simple, predictable arithmetic. The other axis of the value of SaaS pricing was the durability of those products to begin with. As a system of record within either a segment of your operating model or sort of a layer of how you function as an organization, SaaS tools up until now were largely very, very durable, hence sort of the valuation built off of their retention rates. I think the challenge with AI and the challenge with outcome-based pricing is I don't think anybody's really hit on that secret recipe of what the 2x2 matrix of pricing value is for AI. Because if you compare it or you try to plot it against the SaaS matrix, it's actually not very good. Durability is very questionable in the world of AI because there's so many, such a plethora of new entrants. Plus, for especially, from a consumer perspective, people can probably relate to, bouncing between OpenAI and Claude, or bouncing between, one vibe coding tool to the next. It's very, very easy. Likewise, there is no predictability by definition when it comes to outcome-based pricing. So how do we kind of rebuild a similar kind of frame of value in the world of AI? And then, whoever hits on that secret recipe, I think, will be on the leading edge of the valuation conversations, and ultimately probably on the growth conversations too.
It's a good point, but then, I'm going to point to Zoom and Nick, and, this is, and what Rod said around the big guys who've moved fast and changed their business models. You're creating that, let's call it a cornucopia of value, Nick. Like, you've got so much value because you changed the fundamental, value proposition that, you can maybe capture that durability, right? What do you think?
Without sounding too coy, this is a lively internal debate as to what that next gen looks like. And Rod hit the nail on the head. It's the challenges for the CFOs, ours included, is that how do you create that durability, predictability? You're measured on top line performance. You're measured on monthly active users. And those are the analytics that everybody's looking at. And so if you pivot too hard, you'll break the recipe. So it's how do you find accretive growth within the portfolio itself and create new revenue opportunities that are going to emerge from this. And that's incumbent upon us, which is why I'm a huge supporter of Rod's events, where we bring community of partners together to have this dialogue. So there's not, for us, and it goes back to what I shared earlier, the analyst asking, who do I fear from a competitive perspective? Not a particular company. It's the rate of change, and the acceleration of change is what we need to embrace as a community, and then spot those early adopters to bring us down that journey.
Yeah. I don't know, Rod, if you want to jump in, or if that's put a button on it.
I think the key that we all need to look at is no company is going to do it on their own. They are going to need a partner ecosystem to enable them to do it. What people have got to have and develop is the right metrics, the right understanding of the partner community to understand who is going to help me get there, who can I help me get there, and who is not going to make it. And finally, there are a whole raft of new partners developing. What do they need from us in order to help us get to where we want to be? And we don't want to be in the position we were in the cloud, where due to loyalty, not millions or tens of millions, but possibly as much as $1 billion was spent by the tech industry trying to move partners to the cloud who were never, ever going to get there. And we need to build that understanding within our organization so our resources align with the partners who can help us in what is an incredibly transformative period.
I'll just add one final point to that. And the challenge for that emerging partner is creating IP that's scalable. And when you look at the creation of AI agents and how you write those prompts and all of the above, it's really the net of it. It's understanding the workflow and the predictability of the workflow. But then how do you apply IP to that? And that's where it gets very interesting. And I think a lot of that is yet to be unpacked.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a bit of a co-creation exercise too, because I'm wondering, your big companies are trying to create that IP at a product level, but a lot of that IP and that durability, I think, will come from the customer side of the equation, right? So, there's that new impetus to create platform level, but then also be able to collaborate with customers on their own workflow so that it's unique to the value that they're creating for their own businesses, right? So just a whole other new thing that companies need to try to figure out how to do, right? So, all right, last piece of evidence. And, we've talked about it a lot. Rod just touched on it, speed and, the window, right? The window itself and how long it stays open. Back then with the SaaS movie from 2001 to 2006, SaaS adoption went from 12 to 38%. Salesforce reached $1 billion in revenue, as I mentioned. AWS commoditized cloud infrastructure. The window closed and SaaS became table stakes. Now, from 2024 to 2028, 75% of companies are investing in agentic AI. So, this is kind of a prediction, right? Based on numbers that we've got. Smart manufacturing is at 47%. The IT market is growing 10.2%, 2/3 of it through the channel. And the mid-market is the biggest land grab, right? The window is the same length as SaaS, but the technology is moving faster. The infrastructure is already commoditized. The vendors are pivoting in months instead of years. It cuts both ways. The upside is shorter to capture, but the downside is shorter to fix. So I'm going to go back to you, Jason. For someone running a business in any industry, what does moving in this window actually look like practically? What's the difference between an operator using the window and an operator just, hoping it stays open?
I think, again, it goes back to a comment that I made earlier is, kind of internal adoption of the tools to sort of really understand in an authentic way the benefits. Time is of the essence. I think there's an interesting market dynamic that I've observed. I'd be interested to hear if Nick and Rod see the same. Is one difference when it comes to maybe the hype that's been created around AI is almost every customer is in market. It used to be that purchase cycles were pretty predictable, they were cyclical, but largely, I assume because of the hype, it's almost like every customer is in market all at the same time. The majority, you could make an argument, don't know what they're looking for, other than the fact that, the Wall Street Journal has AI on the front page every day. So for operators, it's incumbent to, stay ahead or at least keep up with that, that hype cycle, if you will. Once you start to execute, the foundational principles remain the same. I think that the one difference between kind of operating within that window or waiting or too late maybe is just don't wait too late, is get ahead of it as best as you can. And kind of the best place to start is how can you personally benefit from this as a step one to really understand how it can be transformational to the value you deliver to your customers as well.
Yeah. All right. I want to keep it moving, so I'm going to move on to the reality check, right? So we've just spent, almost an hour really making the case for the movie, right? We walked through all the evidence, but before we move on, I just want to do a reality check. What did one of us just say that you agree with, but you think we're underselling? So this is the opportunity. We've already done it a couple times. Is there anything in the last conversation that you really think is important for people to take away? And I'm just going to open the floor for that.
If I can jump in on this one, we've all talked about customer value, and we've all talked about customer value in terms of what AI might or might not be able to do. We haven't talked enough about how AI actually does it. And what I mean by that is the customer experience. You have two AI technologies, and on one of them, you're going in, you're doing your chat GPT, and you're typing in your prompts, and you're doing all that stuff, and it's producing a great result. You have another one that you're talking to an avatar. The avatar is coming back with everything. It's not doing anything in addition to option A, but it's creating that customer experience, the wow factor. You talked about the NVIDIA example. It wasn't just what they were doing, it was how they were doing it. And I think one of the things that we're going to see moving forward is not just this is what AI will do, but this is the experience it creates for you. And that experience is going to be a defining factor in many areas between the companies that succeed and the companies that don't.
Yeah. All right. No, thank you for that. I totally agree. I mean, we talk a lot about functionality. We're talking about workflows every day. And to be honest with you, I'm still seeing a lot of people, there's that adage, and Jason, you know this one too, from the product side. When a new technology comes out, they apply the new technology the way they applied the old technology. So, right. So we go in to do pilots and someone says, hey, I want an onboarding agent. And, the conversation is about taking the exact same onboarding workflow and then using AI to, just maybe deliver that when, a database and, an automation will still work fine. There's really an opportunity to create a blank page for every single internal workflow and product workflow in your business to understand what the user or customer requires, what their desired outcomes are, where the value lives, and to understand how AI can be used to create a completely new workflow, but a completely new experience and value proposition, right? So I think you're 100% right on that. Okay. So we've spent an hour talking about why the movie fits. I want to spend a little bit of time, talking about how the SaaS parallel isn't perfect, where the analogy breaks down. I'm just going to go through a few of these. The first one is speed, right? SaaS took 7 to 8 years, and we've talked about this already. We've talked about how it's going faster, but SaaS took 7 to 8 years from the first wave to dominance. AI is moving faster because the infrastructure is already commoditized, the distribution channels already exist, and the sales cycles are shorter. The SaaS apocalypse hit roughly 18 months after the AI agents became enterprise viable. Siebel took 5 years to fade, but ServiceNow shipped agentic ACV just 6 weeks after the crash. The compression is absolutely real. The second place the analogy breaks down is labor, right? So SaaS replaced a cost line, and this is just, we can debate this. AI replaces a capability line, which makes it, I think, much more disruptive and a lot more politically sensitive. We're all skirting that conversation about everybody being unemployed, right? Every conversation I'm in. The Klarna story is, I think, a parable, right? The AI worked, but the labor restructuring was harder than the technology. I'm sure they'll figure it eventually, but most companies I think in the short to midterm are going to land where Klarna did, hybrid with flexible contract humans, not where they thought they'd land. So Rod, you've watched channel labor markets shift through every transition. How's the AI labor question actually showing up in conversations? What are partners saying that they're not saying publicly? Or what are people saying that privately that they're not saying publicly?
I mean, I think one of the most interesting conversations I had with a partner recently was someone who had, they do a lot of software development for their customers. And he said, look, Rob, I had 60 software developers, 60 coders in the company. He said, I now have 20. I'm producing more and better code than I did with 60. He said, my goal is basically to fill my retirement fund in the next 2.5 years, because after that, I won't be able to charge for 60 coders like I'm doing at the moment. The pricing will come down to recognize the fact I've only got 20 coders, and my margins are going to shrink enormously as a result of that.
Wow. Wow. I don't know if any of you guys want to build on that, but that's amazing. Yeah, I think we all feel that. I definitely feel that there's this 2 to 3 year window where you kind of have to either establish yourself or individually and as a business, find your way so that you can make money afterward. It's this stratification, everybody from a company to individual. It's interesting. All right.
I think it's going to be much wider than that, Cosmo. I mean, we've just had an election in the UK.
Yeah.
And some very important elections, for example, in Scotland and Wales. And the reason I bring that up is if you heard everyone talking, I only heard AI mentioned twice.
Wow.
It is going to have a huge societal impact, and the powers that be don't appear to have a clue what's
No.
going on. And I think that's going to lead to some real challenges as we move forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I can jump in, I think Rod, that's a very important point. Is I think there's, you know, you could lean in multiple directions when it comes to your political views, but one of the things that the government should be good at is infrastructure. And I think you used that word earlier on in the conversation that AI is a net new infrastructure. And absent the government or other kind of formal institutions helping to define some guardrails around this new infrastructure, then ultimately we leave it to guys like us in the tech industry, which between the four of us, I don't think guys like me are the most appropriate to be establishing societal infrastructure.
I was listening to a guy yesterday. He worked at Meta. He worked at OpenAI, and his prediction is that you have a license to drive a car, you have license to go fishing, you have licenses to do all kinds of things, and that we're going to see licensing for AI for just all kinds of different use cases and use levels, and at an attempt to try to regulate. So we'll see. I'm interested. I think we should do an entire podcast on what you just talked about, Rod, the political, the societal implications. I mean, it is we're all thinking about it. So we'll go there. All right. I want to keep this tight. The third place, I want to talk about the analogy breaking down is the trust threshold, right? And we mentioned this already. Nobody worried that Salesforce would hallucinate a customer record, right? In regulated industries, especially banking, healthcare, right? Insurance. This isn't perception, it's compliance. And, in healthcare, it's people's lives. We have a healthcare client, and believe me, I worry. Like, I don't worry, but I very careful about all the decisions that we're making, because you're dealing with people's health and their records and those types of things. So, Goldman can draft a 95% of an IPO prospectus with AI, but a human still has to sign it. So here's the thing: the productivity loss headlines that the productivity loss headlines miss. Goldman's IPO and M&A bankers are on pace for their biggest pay gains in years. I found this really interesting, and Jason, I'm really curious. I'm going to go to Nick, but I want to hear what you say. AI compresses the junior analyst tier, right? It's just compressed that. It doesn't eliminate the banker. It pushes more value up to senior judgment, which is monetizable. And we're not just seeing that in banking. We're seeing that at enterprise level. So, Nick, Zoom partners with regulated industries. You partner and your partners partner with in these regulated industries every day. How is that trust threshold showing up in your sales motion, and where are people getting stuck?
So if I could give the partner community some advice on how to build that practice, we've talked about the AI services model and the emerging.
Yeah.
But if you take anything away from what I'm about to share with you, this is really probably the most important piece from me personally during this, is that the trust threshold is real, especially for regulated industries. So what does a partner need to do? Partner needs to be able to prove that the AI performed compliantly. Takeaway number one. There's tools out there. This is why our sales motion starts with governance, not features. We lead with things like Zoom Compliance Manager, native capture, e-discovery, legal hold, data residency controls. So partners can show auditors exactly how the AI decisions are logged and contained. Remember, there's this fear factor. So if you have the ability and can demonstrate that trust, because trust has to be a design principle, not a check back, right? Partners need to be able to articulate how the data flows. Then don't shy away from the compliance officer. Bring them into the room early and show that AI outputs are traceable and human verified. You know, we just talked about the whole labor impact and all of the above. This is where, and I'm going to date myself now, is I look to my 6 and 4-year-old grandchildren like, what is going to be their careers?
Yeah.
And my little 6-year-old, I'm like, buddy, I'm going to teach you everything about analytics. I'm going to teach you everything about automation. And because that's kind of that the human verification is not going to go away.
Yeah.
And that's where you get the breakthrough of the compliance officer, whether it's in banking, healthcare, public sector. The win pattern is the exact same.
Yeah.
Transparency first, automation second. And once trust is earned, scales follow. So build an AI perform compliant model, put the infrastructure in so you can trace your human verification, and make sure that your design principles are checkable. If you have that at the forefront of your practice, you will come out with a very unique opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if any of you guys want to dive in on that. I saw some nods, but I completely agree.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Nick said from a solution topology perspective, from a product perspective. The analogy that I like to use, you know, echoing the governance as kind of a fundamental requirement, is the way that I like to think about effective AI is to think of a beehive. And, you know, what I advocate to customers that I work with is, you know, your people / you should always be the queen bee. And if you think about how a beehive operates, the queen bee is the one that makes all the decisions, you know, carries all the judgment, but she has available to her an army of worker bees. Each one of those worker bees does a highly specific job. In doing that, she scales, you know, the capabilities of the hive. And second of all, it also limits the blast radius of risk of any one of those individual worker bees. So that kind of architecture of how best to deploy in a, you know, highly governed way AI from a solution perspective, you know, I agree wholeheartedly with what Nick said.
Yeah. And, you know, I just want to point out this word judgment, it keeps coming up, right? And I don't think people really understand what it means. I think, you know, what does that mean? The boss is going to make all the calls. You know, I just want to talk, and a lot of people might already experience this, but when you use AI, I using it every day, and I see 2 areas where, you know, the AI just doesn't do it. One, I'm going to talk about context drift, right? So I'm building context, and companies using AI are building context every day. Every conversation, every Slack message, every email, every Zoom recording, that's going into your knowledge base. It's creating context. And when workers, as we try to output things, sales presentations, webinar scripts, like, you know, anything that we're trying to produce, it's using that data. And so how do you keep data canonical? Like, what data stays canonical? What data is being referenced as hundreds or thousands of workers are using that source data to produce outputs every single day? So to run our business, we had to provide hundreds, if not thousands, of humans in the loop that are very specifically trained on those workflows and the outputs required and the inputs that are coming in, just to manage context. The human then, who's pulling context and building things using AI, and the agents, whether they're autonomous or with the human, are also making those judgments. You got to read that sales deck before you send it out. You have to personalize it. You have to really think through. You can't do what I'm seeing some people do, where they produce something and they send it to you and you're like, oh my God, you made this in 30 seconds and you send it to me to do the iterations on it, right? So it's a lot of iterating time on the outputs. So the human's doing that, but then, you know, so it's really about that judgment that you talked about. It's that iterating what the outputs are, but then also managing, I think, the context on the other side. We've also been putting humans in the loop between the AI and that iterating human, depending on the workflow. So if you're dealing with a regulated industry like we just talked about, we want to start to catch that, because that's where we catch context drift as well. So Nick, I think you're right on the money. Like, you know, still think it's going to be a long time before we can put multiple agents managing context and output, but, you know, we're still going to need human eyeballs on it.
Correct.
Right. And then connect to the relationships. I still think relationships are important. Okay. We're moving in time. I want to move forward. The fourth break, right? So SaaS adoption was relatively uniform across industries. AI is not. We talked about that, right? Manufacturing is at 47% smart factory adoption. And you know how much of that is really running in production. JP Morgan is running 450 AI use cases. And, you know, meanwhile, a lot of the mid-market companies that we speak to, they haven't even started. Maybe they've had a few pilots. They've got bolt-ons in their, you know, Microsoft 365, but, you know, they haven't even started. So huge, you know, stratification there. Jason, so across the you know, the portfolios that you're seeing, are you seeing different industries adopt at radically different rates? What does that asymmetry look like in your modeling?
Absolutely. And I think this is the parallel that probably is closest to other kind of technological enabling, you know, inflection points of the past. It's kind of the usual suspects. Smaller companies, you know, startups, companies in the SMB space where the decision-making velocity is much faster. They are faster, if not to adopt, faster to experiment. And then, you know, Nick and Rod both touched on this, but the compliance and regulatory needs and just risk aversion in the larger enterprises tends to skew to slower decision making, slower experimentation, which again is probably, like I said, the closest parallel to all these other movies that we've seen before. A little bit different, but largely the same if you look at the macro trends.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody, you know, want to jump in on that? I'm just going to, I think I'm going to skip one of our segments. So just want to find, roll through here.
The only thing I'd say is bouncing off what Nick said, and I think that was great advice for the partner community. If I was a partner, the more you understand about your customer, the more successful you're going to be. I would be looking at if you're talking about compliance in a complex industry like healthcare or finance or whatever, you don't want a general compliance person. You want someone from that industry who can absolutely understand what's going on. And I think one of the things that AI is going to create is an even faster move amongst the partner community to looking at specific vertical markets, maybe multiple vertical markets within a single partner, but that deep understanding of how that market operates is going to be incredibly important to the success of many partners, particularly as they get into the mid and large corporate marketplaces.
Yeah. Yeah. So guys, we're burning a lot of time. We've spent a lot. I mean, it's been a great conversation. I'm actually going to skip one of our segments and move to our close to let you guys move on with your day. So, you know, but before we close, I just want to say, you know, each one of you came into this conversation with something in your head, an insight, a conviction, a warning. We've covered so much ground, but I guarantee there's something, you know, sitting in each one of you that hasn't had an opening yet. So, you know, what's the one thing maybe you haven't said that you think, you know, the audience needs to hear? You know, I'm just going to open the floor.
Jason, go ahead, man. Put you on the spot.
Thanks, Nick.
Don't worry,
you know, the one thing that I'll say is, you know, AI can be overwhelming. It can be intimidating. There is a lot of noise out there. Again, I'm going to blame maybe the marketing community associated with AI. But at the end of the day, it's important to not lose sight of the fact that it is a huge opportunity to, you know, redefine and add additional value that you can deliver to your customers. So, you know, it's important to take a more practical stance rather. Like I said, so I've mentioned it a few times, is, you know, try adopting it for your own personal workflows. That can kind of, you know, mute some of the noise out there, gets you a little bit more of a practical understanding of where and how it can impact. And then from there, you have a much more stable foundation to start thinking about how you can apply it to your business as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Rod, if a channel partner was listening, how, and they know they need to move, what's the single first best step they can make this week?
It depends where their team are with AI. I would provide the tools both within the workplace and at home for your team to use AI in all aspects of their life. I would monitor that very carefully. That will tell you which members of your team are actually most likely to be able to move forward with you in an AI environment. And I would look very carefully at where you are business-wise, picking up on what I said earlier. Build specific expertise in specific sectors.
Yeah.
That will be invaluable for you. I think AI is going to kill the generalist.
Yeah. There's a whole other podcast for us. Nick, for business leaders in any industry, if I got my questions mixed up. Nick, if a partner came to Zoom tomorrow and says we want to build an AI practice on your platform, where do you point them first?
First and foremost, I think Jason and Rod both said it. Use the technology yourself. Don't be afraid to use it, because once you start using it, you'll understand the fundamentals. So first, use the technology. Second, I think Cosmo, you touched on this. As you get really good at using it, allow your AI agent to understand your contextual learning and to understand you, and train your digital twin so that it has the ability to articulate you as an individual. And so if a partner was knocking on my door, first of all, encourage them to use the platform themselves. Second, accelerate your learning. Accelerate your practice. Don't be a generalist. Be somewhat segmented. And then build your business practice around that. That would be my kind of 3 check boxes.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. A lot of the consulting that we have to do is, we get called in because someone says, hey, we want to transform our business using AI. And what they're thinking in their mind is, we want to agentify some workflows, right? We talked about this, and they start off with operations use cases, and then maybe we'll get into the product discussion. But then, when you change your business model, you're not just saying, hey, we're creating a whole bunch of new value. It's not like launching new products or making your services better. It's you need to actually transform your business as well, right? So what is your messaging? What do your target audience segments look like now? Are there some that are better? Have new audiences emerged that you couldn't operate in those areas before? We work with one company who is in the we have an AI technician agent. So imagine all of those technicians across the world. They fix restaurant equipment. They fix HVAC units, right? They're the guys on the roof of the bank when the heating goes down, and they're on the roof fixing it. They got to show up to. They get dispatched. They show up to a business. They find the unit. They identify the unit. They try to pull any documentation if they don't know how it works. They diagnose the problem. Maybe they have to order parts. In that process, they have to check warranty. Someone's checking warranty and the credit availability for the customer. They have to get the part ordered. They might have to leave and go pick up the part, or wait a day, or wait a week for a part, and come back and then do that repair, right? So there are a lot of companies in that service that workflow. There's the vendor, there is individual service companies, there are third-party enablement companies, that provide the training to those service technicians that are not part of the technician company. There are warranty and financial vendors that manage that whole process and provide infrastructure. And so when we go in and we look at a workflow, we're not just looking at an internal workflow or a product. We might be looking not just cross-functionally, but across multiple suppliers. And the company says, hey, wait a minute. You mean we can check the warranty? We can do the credit check. We can have the schedule the next meeting. We can walk through get our technician that would take a year to get trained with another technician in the van. We can have them out on calls themselves in 2 months with this twin because the AI is kind of walking them through everything. So you're reimagining that multiple workflows and your business, and that takes, that's why we also provide the consulting. So there's also a business layer on top of that, because it allows you to look at your segments, look at your business model, look at your markets, and find your growth opportunities. All right, that was supposed to be short, and I added a story there that made it longer. All right, so let me just go to the close. I'm going to end it there. Rod, thanks for your 30 years. You're going to keep going. I know I'm going to be working with you probably another 20 or 30, God knows how long. Nick, thanks for letting us see inside a real pivot. I mean, I love listening to your stories, and now you're bringing the Zoom stories. It's so interesting. All that, you're not letting too much out of the bag, but just getting a glimpse into how the organization works. It's amazing. Jason, thanks for what you do, all your insights. I love the perspective from the product all the way, the portfolio work. Always bringing good stuff to the table. What I would say is to the audience is I would just say, if I were to give you one specific action this week, not next week, not next quarter, pick one workflow in your business that's still priced by seats or run by humans, or whether it's product or operationally, it's a pain point that you need to improve. Talk to the person actually doing the work, not the executive who's sponsoring the workflow, but the person doing it. Ask them three things. First, what is the AI handle for them right now? Like, how are they using it? Are they using, Claude that they're not supposed to be using? Is there something bolt on? Second, what does the AI get wrong? And third, what still requires the humans to weigh in on? Those answers will give you a sense of where your AI opportunity is, or even where your AI risk is. Either way, you're going to know where to move. And if you know someone in any industry still treating AI as next year's problem, as you can hear from the conversation, this is already past. Like, this is going. You need to be in the game, or you're probably not going to survive. Send them this episode. The evidence is here. The window's open, and the pattern isn't a prediction anymore. It's record. Thank you for listening. This is no AI theater. Real conversations, as you can see, with the people implementing AI on the ground. I'm Cosmo Mariano, helping you run like an AI business operator. We'll see you in the field. Guys, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cosmo.
Nice, Cosmo.
Thanks, guys. All right. Talk to you soon. We can stay on because I'm just going to cut it there. Guys, that went long.
I'm gonna go sell something now.
You got to go kill something?
I gotta go sell something.
Oh, something. I'm so sorry to keep you on long, but holy smoke, you guys are amazing. That was, I don't know if it's going to be super exciting, but it's super interesting. Like, I can't believe how much ground you guys covered.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having us. Great meeting you guys.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm holding you late on meetings. Have a good one. I'll reach out. I'll send you details. Take care, buddy.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.